Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we join Elijah Emery again for actually talking about the Tyranny of Merit, What Becomes of the Common Good by Michael Sandel. And there's a couple of topics we wanted to talk about, although I think it's interesting this theme in Sandel's work and maybe why he considers himself a communitarian is this idea of the common good, because a common good, and I know this is going to sound weird from a leftist, but it's one of the most pernicious ideas I think I've ever heard of in like general political thinking, because no one has any idea how to define it ever. Like, um, and if you go back to like, uh, the technocratic end of of like French political liberalism, through technocracy, all the way back, actually, arguably to like the virtue engineers and the Jacobins in the mountain. You have this strain of using the common good in a way that actually is what Sandel is objecting to, which is
as a
basically
justification for the underlying power basis as it exists.
right. And as a justification for what would be seen as expert meddling in that power base. So not just the status quo, but we get to maintain the status quo
effectively,
and we're democratic, but everything's actually decided by managers. And I do think in the conservative complaints about modern American political thinking and world political thinking, because they're even more mad about this in Europe, where I think it's also arguably more actually a thing. There is an assumption that elite opinion of experts is legitimate. So I remember arguing with a liberal friend of mine who's considered liberal socialist, John Corman. And I'm going to have him back on the show one day, and we'll finish this debate because I wanted to get into our differences. But one of the arguments I had with him is he thought that, like, well, we need to save democracy, but also we need professional politicians because policy needs to be done by professionals. And I was like, those are two diametrically opposed impulses, and you cannot actually justify them. And almost every liberal I know, and most non-liberals, really, because if we get into what even like conservatives or reactionaries want to replace this stuff with, they actually do think that they know the good too, and it's not really the common opinion or the common consensus. They only appeal to that rhetorically.
Yeah, they want natural law.
Yeah, and natural law for them is basically God thinks like me. We should be pretty clear on this, because it's not like they want DeSantis is not trying to instill 2,000-year-old church tradition.
Yeah. He's not an integralist. He's not consistent enough to be one.
No, but the kind of integralist and corporatist right, which I am going to start talking more about on my other show, once we get through Dubin, I think we're going to go to one of these guys next. I think we have to admit that, like, their vision of what, say, the strong gods are, to bring that up, is still largely speaking both technocratically implemented. I mean, one of the ironies of the DeSantis world is it massively expands government bureaucracy everywhere. Because now you not just need all the technical things, you now need moral specialists on everything to weigh whether or not a math equation has social and emotional learning, which is secretly communism in it.
I think yes, and it's good. No, I'm joking, but you're completely right about this. Many of the most significant expanders of the realm of expertise have been right-wingers using expertise to police moral values. And also in certain types of expertise that are ostensibly dedicated to simplicity, such as originalism, within the field of law, what it actually does is it clamps down on the acceptable styles of interpretation in a way which requires expertise at interpreting what textualism entails. And in that way makes law more inaccessible, because there's only a certain number of techniques which are accepted.
Yeah. And interestingly, I've been doing things on hermeneutics because I realize that most leftists actually don't really understand that they're engaged in that all the time, and thus they do bad hermeneutical interpretations. And I don't just mean like on the popular level. I mean on even in academics right now, like Marxist academics, their hermeneutics are hidden and often hidden from themselves. And there's just big assumptions being made that are taken for granted that they don't even understand, their readers don't share. So there's a total lack of access, or they'll state things that are interpretive as truth, etc. And that's just from a lack of realization that's what's going on. With Interestingly, the reason why I bring this up in law is it mirrors the kind of what we call like the literal critical method of OG fundamentalists. And I don't mean that in the slur form. I mean that literally in the
It's all there on the page. You just have to unlock the secret meeting.
Yeah, like I mean it also like the people who call themselves fundamentalists in response to Protestant liberal Anglicanism in the 19th century, that there is a direct parallel between that style of interpretation and originalism. And while sometimes I am, there have been times where I'm more sympathetic to originalism than like the living constitution shenanigans, because I've always found that to be somewhat dishonest. It is clear to me that one, if you look at the way the Supreme Court and other conservative juridical bodies actually operate, they don't operate on originalist principles, except for like weirdos like Scalia.
I mean, not even, because if he operated on originalist principles, he'd be like supporting reparations based on the 13th Amendment.
Right. Well, but he actually, I think he secretly harbored originalist principles that the 13th and 14th Amendments are invalid. But he's never said that.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, that's an old conservative argument that since the Civil War states were excluded from the adoption of those amendments, that they don't count.
Yeah, but anyway, the point is that like, yes, it's a specific interpretation of what is supposed to be a universally applicable hermeneutic. And I think this is actually relevant to the tyranny of merit, because one thing, the connection to the common good, is that a regime of expertise trains people in a specific method of interpretation. And that interpretation is that the common good is equated to a situation where there's greater levels of expertise, there's more complication in society, and there's a reconciliation between democracy and expert rule in some way. And I think that Sandel's common good pushes back on this, which shows both the flexibility of what the common good entails and also highlights the inadequacies of the expert model of the common good.
I mean, but to tie this up, I think this is part of Sandel's larger communitarian project. Like, if you go back to his book on democracy, he talks about the move from a civic republic to an administrative state in crisis, which was his last revision to that book. And when you read his administrative state book, particularly given where conservative arguments have gone now, and I know leftists actually don't tend to follow conservative arguments, they tend to follow flashy reactionary arguments. But that is where a lot of conservative ire is focused, is on the administrative state. And ironically, and this is one of the things where I think they do kind of have a point, the administrative state is seen as by a lot of liberals as better able to bring about democratic will because it's not tied in deliberation. And they point out, well, but it's effectively arbitrary will, because even the executive branch can only really do anything about it by like gutting it. It doesn't. There's not that many checks on it because it's not even part of the constitutional checks and balance system. It wasn't really supposed to be a thing at the federal level. Clearly, the framers kind of invented it at the state level. If you read like the Ward Republic stuff by Jefferson, he clearly thought it was going to be actually at the municipal level.
Yeah.
Problems with that are problems of scale and problems of the fact that like Jefferson just assumed yeoman farming culture was going to be the thing forever. And I know that's thrown out by Marxists often to just like discount the founding fathers. But when you actually read what Jefferson and co were writing, it make you like all of a sudden, like even the more democratic ones, of which Jefferson was, you start seeing their big flaws. Like they don't have a way to deal with the fact the economy is already outstripping their civic vision of administration.
They're living in the 18th century.
Right. Although, I mean, even in the 18th century, you were already beginning to see that taxed. I mean, that's sort of the whole thing that led to the revolution in the first place. But it's something to think about when you think about today, when we talk about like why doesn't the American vision seem uniquely undemocratic? It's because more and more functions have been moved to levels that are less democratic, which that were not envisioned as being there. In response to just fundamental changes in, I'm not just the economy. I actually think that I don't want to be a vulgar Marxist and say it's just the economy, but it's a lot of it's the economy. Like, the number of powers the federal government has attenuated itself through the Commerce Clause is kind of amazing, but kind of also fair. And then you work in law, but it's always amazed to me also weird carve outs to that, such as like insurance law, which is by a Supreme Court thing, a state issue, somewhat disastrously so.
Yeah.
And so you have these kind of economic regulations in the United States that are in tension with each other, but also cause other regulations that, for example, like,
you could call it Klug.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sandel's big about this, but he's also actually right that part of the problem here is that the complexity the experts need to manage is also somewhat caused by the experts themselves. In Sandel's world, I don't think he thinks, and I don't either, that it was intentional.
No, it was. What you do is you commit to one style of governance, and you need to continually invest in it, and then that ends up supplanting other things over a long period of time. I don't think it was a nefarious plot for the most part to build an administrative state. It just turns out that once you build an administrative state, you need to continually buttress it.
Now, what's interesting about Sandel, and I almost pulled out another book by him that I have back there to talk about this, because it's actually kind of like parallel to this book, and I know he means it to be a parallel to this book because it has the same airport cover, which is another book about the common good. It's another book about the common good, but it's what markets can't buy. So interestingly, for most people who critique elite development, although we will give the Patrick Deneen's of the world credit that they don't do this, but they posit market controls to that. And actually, Sandel has a whole nother book about why market controls do not do that. Because they can't arbitrate values in that sense. They treat all values as equal. Their definition of rationality is necessarily circular.
He mentions this in the Critique of Merit from the Right in this book, where he talks about how right-wing critics of merit seek to eliminate the distinction, to distinguish value and merit. They say that value is arbitrary and determined by society, and merit is internal and determined by the common good. But he points out that if you're incentivizing value, it's really hard to keep those categories separate. And that's one reason why, say, the right libertarian critique of meritocracy often collapses. which I think you see very intuitively in the fact that it does make some, like, Reaganomics makes more sense if you believe that personal morality is an effective check on the rapaciousness of market behavior, that people will simply behave well. It turns out that if you have incentives for them to behave poorly, barring extraordinary cases, most people will behave as the incentives dictate. And in fact, the value system will change to accommodate those incentives.
And you know where this can become clear in a way that's not moral, or people, or feels less moral to people. Health policy. When we think about like what it means to be poor in the U.S., a fairly rich country, versus what it means to be poor in Europe or Canada, and in all cases, there's more negative outcomes, and there's outcomes that are imposed upon people. There's also outcomes that are self-reinforcing behavior that maybe an individual can opt out, but the incentives don't indicate that most people can. But just to put it very clearly, like, obesity in America is class related, and I know like that's not become a thing that either side likes to say, because we're in the moment of fat acceptance, which I think actually as a social movement is a good thing. But I think when we're talking about like that in regards to like accepting what is objectively shitty policy incentives for people is a bad thing.
Yeah, you shouldn't morally judge someone for being fat.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. You
And
should
there's
also
also
make it very easy for people to be healthier than they are currently uh, are, which is not an effective moral judgment. It's an effective food policy and the fact that our cities are
this
designed
is
around cars.
I was gonna say it's a city policy. I mean, like the moment I left the United States and just had tacit walking encouraged into my life, I dropped like 50 pounds. Like, and that's not an exaggeration even. And so like that was a wake up moment for me, because that was a social policy issue that doesn't even seem directly related. It wasn't what Michael Pollan was talking about at the time. I remember, because this was in the time where Michael Pollan was like the biggest thing. And if you want to see that, you look at this. Like for example, we have things right now that make stable marriages a class good, and up to and including dating apps, but that's actually like the least of your problems. Now, should stable marriages be a good? I don't know. That's having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parents help with the raising kids is definitely, and by parents I mean allo parents, is definitely better than one. Do they need to be married? I don't know, because normally when you're looking at the marriage studies, that you're actually looking at as like co-parenting models, and it doesn't really matter who fills in those roles as long as the roles are filled in by multiple people. But our incentive structure for, say, poor women is actually really bad across the board. And I think about this also, for example, when someone becomes an ideological incel, I think they're lost to humanity for the most part. But I do think, and I do think liberal rhetoric around this has actually gotten better in the last 4 or 5 years than it was 6 or 7 years ago when the incel phenomenon first started. Because liberal rhetoric then was like, oh, they're, the only thing that would cause people to do this is privilege, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is not, listen to what these guys say. This is not a privileged discourse.
No, they're lonely, have low employment outcomes, and live in rural areas where they don't see that many people.
Right. It's a community destruction outcome, of which a pernicious ideology that works off of the idea of privilege comes in and fills in. But if you look at the material conditions that makes that attractive, hating people like that, hating women like that, for people with no access to women, is not actually, does not necessarily make a lot of like it's not socially reinforcing in ways that help most people who get involved in it.
Certainly.
So to
I
tie
think
this back into this, though, what's interesting about the discourse about, say, incels is not that we treated this as a social problem, or when we do see it as a social problem, it's treated like the Jordan Peterson, well, women should just have to marry incels. It's like, no, you're not looking at the larger context that creates this problem. Because you are looking at this from the standpoint of individual merit and education. Because I can tell you what I see every time someone talks about this, even in a compassionate way. And I've seen it in article after article recently. Well, if men would get off the video games and invest a little bit of themselves and do therapy and do whatever, a lot of this stuff would go away. And I'm like, okay, but why is all that not happening? Because most people do want that. And I know they want it because stupid therapy TikTok exists because people can't get this stuff. Right? Like,
you have
even
like apps like
though it's
BetterHelp
cheaper
now.
Yeah.
Which is just about like, it is about making therapy accessible to the masses. It's just like the worst kind, and it's completely inadequate.
And we see this more and more. Like I've been reading all this, Mark Fisher stuff from not even a decade ago, and the assumption is that you're going to throw pills at people. I'm like, we don't do that anymore. That's already fallen apart. That was falling apart actually when he was writing about it. Now we give like the shittiest, like Zoom level version of cognitive behavioral therapy at people for $100 a pop, and with some financial aid to make it cheaper than that.
I mean, I think it also comes back into the community argument from earlier, which is that the best therapists approximate the role of a priest or a rabbi or a teacher, somebody who you trust, who's in a position of earned authority and you think is qualified to give you advice, and who you trust. So even though it is a market relationship, the goal is to make it feel as little like that as possible, but using the money still insulate yourself from some of the norms of that come up in say friendship, where you don't want to overburden someone.
Right.
And in this way, it's the market stepping in to provide people with friends, sort of, just a very odd type of friendship.
Well, and this is one of these things where where like I'm not in the anti-psychiatric movement. I don't want people to understand that, but where I understand how it's come up over and over again.
Yeah. No, I'm pro therapy.
Right.
But I do recognize what it's meant to do. Or
yes.
what its role is, I should say.
Well, I mean, my thing is like, I don't know what a priest is going to do for you if you have borderline personality disorder, for real. But like, it is, but the spectrum of what people go to therapists for has dramatically expanded because partly in response to the expansion of a prior treatment so that we could medicalize that. A lot of that medicalization has turned out to be on, like most of the psychological stuff, on less than sound ground, which is interesting that doesn't come up in this book, actually, that how much of the expertise has been undone by experts finally monitoring themselves, often in weird scenarios, like me discovering that the origins of the replication crisis started with the crisis in parapsychology was something that blew my mind. And for people who keep on saying, can you show me a paper about this? I can't. There is a couple of Lancet articles, and then an article on, then an episode of The Constant for people who want to pick this up to get where I got it from. There's not one thing where they set out to do the replication standards in a way that made certain kinds of parapsychological results more valid, and then when they applied it to all this positive psychology stuff too, it's where it started falling apart. So it's interesting to know that. Now, what I find interesting about that though is, while that's been weaponized in this kind of populist uprising moment, it actually comes out of academic discourse itself. And that's the irony of so much of this anti-meritocratic stuff is, and this anti-PMC stuff as well, is that it comes out of people who either know that this is a problem and but they're trying to save their meritocratic. I mean, I think part of Sandel's goal here, as much as like reinstituting the common good in society, is also to save the intellectual institutions that he sees as operating on a meritocratic basis, because he's afraid of the cost of them going away.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's also motivating this, and I don't think like people necessarily see that, but there's a whole lot like.
I mean, I think you honestly see this in the social base of left-wing politics in the United States, which is like downwardly mobile, educated people who gained entrance to the meritocratic system for the most part. I mean, you see this in like, say, the gentrifier class, which voted in AOC and votes in most of the left-wing electeds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why that stuff comes out of like. Man, this is going to get me in trouble. When you look at, for example, where the most progressive parts of the Democratic Party come from, if not from Michigan and refugee communities, aka Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib, because I have actually asked people to think, like, why does the squad's women of color vote differently than all the other women of color in the Senate? Because they kind of do. Where's that coming from? You know, why is the Black Congressional Caucus not the same as the squad? And there's two things, and one is like some of it's refugee community issues, and the other is it's this gentrifier class that, honestly, and this messes up the narrative, is often of color, because you're talking about rich immigrants moving into the children of rich immigrants who are now educated, who benefited from 2 or 3 generations, coming back into their own communities, but they are gentrifiers too, even though it's their communities, and they make political allegiances with a lot of like progressives who live in those communities, white progressives who live in those communities as well, because the other great irony of American politics is that the part of American politics that talks the most about race, until recently anyway, is also, objectively speaking, and poll after poll, the whitest part of American politics.
Yeah.
And that irony has just not, like, I mean, people bring it up, but it's just, I'm like, progressives are literally way whiter than the general public, because they're also way more educated, and what they take for the opinion of color, and this is an Adolph Reed point, but Wendy's right on, is actually people who demographically more look like them than they look like the average person of the quote community of color which they're representing.
Yeah.
And
this isn't, I'm going to say again, just for the listeners, this isn't a moral judgment. I want to make sure that we're very clear on this.
This is just a fact.
This is a fact. And I also think that it's relevant to Sandel's critique, because the people who are most disconcerted with meritocracy are people who have gained access to meritocratic institutions and have lost in the game of meritocracy. For a variety of reasons. You see this in conservative critics of meritocracy who are disappointed that they have to give up their conservative viewpoints because the meritocracy has a liberal bias.
And something that I think has moved from something an administrative bias that looks like liberalism to an actual liberal bias. Like, I feel like that's real in a way that we can statistically prove. And ironically, when conservatives started complaining about it, it was not actually super real yet. Because they started complaining about it in the 90s. They started complaining about it with with William Buckley back in the day. But when it really became a dominant talking point was in the Rush Limbaugh era. It was not yet true. There was still a fair amount. There were entire fields that you could predict more than economics.
I mean, especially in the
just
the corporate elite, like it was not a situation where there was a liberal bias. But now, like, finance is a liberal institution for the most part. You know, not like left wing, not liberal in the way they use it, but it's a liberal institution. They're Bidenists. And then on the left, the critics of meritocracy are people who have been exposed to the extraordinary financial costs of meritocracy and the fact that not all access to the meritocracy is created equal. Participation in more left-wing positions, I mean, jobs like going into social work or something, which require a great deal of educational commitment and a large amount of time in university, are way too expensive. And that's why one reason you see that the big flashpoint between like Warrenists and Sanders supporters, or one of many flashpoints, was how much student debt should be canceled. Because this is a cost which is impressed upon people who have access to the meritocratic system and the meritocratic institutions, but have lost a lot of money participating in it.
And that has had weird knock-on effects in ways that confuse people. Like a patron of mine was talking about journalists as PMC and like power, and I'm like, the irony about journalism is it used to be a profession that you could go with little to no education, community college, start up, get in there as long as you were literate. You knew you needed a good high school education. That was it. And so there was a lot of working class journalists. What ended that actually is complicated, but it wasn't a PMC conspiracy. It was actually market derivatives, which caused the local ad base to fall apart, largely due to the internet. The expansion of surviving media to need to be diffused over large groups of areas, so you needed to have people with more kinds of access, leading to there being less jobs in it, and that you actually needed to have people who could take a job that was relatively high prestige because of access, but relatively low paying, which favors the children, actually, not the up and coming, of elite. So it's exactly the people you're talking about, like downwardly mobile elite people. And I saw that in real time. For people who don't know, I trained, my initial training was to be a science journalist way back, before I fucked with law, before I fucked with philosophy and literature. And I saw this trend happening, and people like me were like, well, there's no way I can compete in this field if I have to not get paid for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And this is one reason why critiques of merit are so potent now. There's a bigger market base to buy critiques of merit because more people have been exposed to its inadequacies. And so the meritocracy, which I think Sandel portrays as relatively strong, is in a weaker position as a justification for rule than it has been in probably 70 years.
No, and this is something that I see missing. I keep on filling this in Sandel, but he doesn't do this. I have talked a lot about a new phase of technocracy that isn't technical, and this, and I'll admit, I sound like a conservative when I say this. Like, that is therapeutic and moral, because you have these complex systems that these people objectively cannot manage. And it is becoming clear that the meritocracy for a lot of these things is not manageable. Now, I'm not talking about like healthcare expertise. Like, yes, someone can learn how to be a good heart surgeon. I'm talking about like
operating a bureaucracy.
Yeah, operating a bureaucracy, dealing with like reforming schools. Like, school reform movement, frankly, has largely given up. Even right now.
That's why I think that's one reason you see that the most animated critiques of the school system are usually about cutting back and simplifying it. but it's about simplifying it in ways often which are amenable to very bad impulses, either from the right, where they're like, simplify it by eliminating sex ed, or from the left, where it's like, simplify it by not offering advanced math classes because minorities do worse at them. I mean, it's a deregulatory impulse, honestly, because it's recognized as unmanageable.
Right. I mean, and this was something that I have been harping about the left for a long time, because there's a lot of the left that's half in my Marxist-socialist world and half in progressive world, and they don't see that, like, Marxists, for example, tend to not actually be super happy about regulation as a means to fix social policy. And the reason why we don't, one is, like, you want to talk about creating a new class, have to have a bunch of regulators handle everything. And you will hear liberals like balk at this, and I'm like, eventually you also can't regulate everything. The cost of maintaining the data systems alone becomes almost as onerous as a physical input than actually doing the thing. And schooling is where this is abundantly clear. One of the things that I've talked to people about against, like, the David Graeber tendency, David Graeber basically has a form of this in Bullshit Jobs. It is kind of actually the same thing Sandel is doing, but he's putting it as why everyone feels like their job is bullshit. He doesn't believe in Marxist alienation, so he has to come up with another way. And it's because he's like, all these jobs are non-productive. The thing is, though, these jobs aren't coming out of nothing. They're not actually created to create more jobs. They're created so that people can monitor the work that other people do to recognize the problems of regulation. And interestingly, in a book that people don't like as much by David Graeber, he does kind of get at this. And it's a book called The Utopia of Rules, where he realizes this next step. But like, he thinks this is like almost like a conspiracy to employ all these people. And in some ways it can become that, see higher ed. But I don't think that's the case in, say, in like primary and secondary education, where this is just rampant and it has no, like, we are simplifying, dropping programs and stuff, but very few people have looked at the fact that, like, every school board I know is triple the size of what it was, and it can't be cut back. All those positions are now essential. Why are they essential? Because actually they meet government oversight regulations. And for people who go, oh, that's liberal, no, a lot of them also came from NCLB days, which have only been paused, but they still have to be generally maintained. Like, so both the left and the right, in the conventional sense here, not in like my sense, have contributed to this problem in trying to fix it. I mean, if you think, like, we were talking about DeSantis a little while ago, and like that impulse, right? Which creates like all these like moral czars, and more paperwork, and even its attempts at transparency, because it's deliberately designed to klug up the system, actually leads to other problems, and it's creating kinds of problems in Florida that are like that people should really look at. For example, that Florida can't get enough teachers, which is why it has that crazy rule that if, like, you're a spouse of a military person, that, like, that you could go be a teacher. That is not just a good patriotic, like, that's the gloss DeSantis gave it. It's a desperation move
to deal with the fact that there's like physically not enough teachers to teach the kids, which is especially important because school takes care of everything in society. It takes care of nutrition. It takes care of like training you not to be racist now. It takes care of childcare. It's an overburdened institution because it's all we have.
But I mean, and this is particularly true in the United States, because basically every social institution and most familial ones are replaced by it. And frankly, when people opt out of it, what do they have to do? Well, you have to go back to a parent, usually a woman, staying at home to replicate the labor.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can't afford it, except that, and this is an interesting crisis that we're in right now. Again, Sandel doesn't deal with, but it actually is tied into his meritocracy thing. Because one of the things that Biden is, we need more care workers. Well, why do we need more care workers? So that people can go back to work. Because like getting women back into the workforce while also having them have children is crucial for the U.S. economy in the long run, as long as immigration's stymied. And why is immigration stymied? And again, that's tied into meritocratic impulse as well. Like, who was pro-immigration? Well, it used to be corporate people and highly skilled labor, because we could do brain drain in other countries. And now that that's ending, you're seeing you're seeing a policy develop around that. That, like, I mean, this is what I want progressives to understand from this conversation, actually. And you and I are going to have a conversation for my patrons where we go into this explicitly, not just framed in Sandel, but like, if your argument is expertise and you don't have it, and then your argument is moral and you don't have that either, or you don't understand the morality of the general public because you're actually in an expertise mind trying to fool it as a moral mind or whatever, you hit a wall with this stuff where you can't, like, progressives will say about immigration, well, it's always something that the Democrats will trade away for something else. And I'm like, well, it is, because frankly, your argument about it is purely moral. And a pure moral statement, particularly one that doesn't have a specific virtue or other corresponding goals, that is just based on altruism, will never fly at a mass level. It might fly as an individual morality. It's often going to fly, but that doesn't scale. And that seems to really confuse progressives. But that's like, I can't think of society that's ever operated off of like pure. I can think of societies that have made governmental decisions that may seem non-rational if they are within a value that is rational to that social system.
Yeah, I mean, it's often those decisions actually just amount to efforts at social reproduction,
right?
Which is a rational goal,
right? But and honestly, how immigration was liberalized in America, which it was not liberalized by the Democrats, it was liberalized by Reagan, was a
well, it was liberalized by the Democrats since '65
to some degree.
It was liberalized by both groups, is what I'm saying. But it was done not out of the kindness of people's hearts. It was done because there weren't enough European immigrants, and we needed to oppose the Soviet Union.
Well, that's the reason why in the '65, the reason why in '80 is everyone could see that when the baby boomers got old, you didn't have a tax base for them, and they built up. And this is why I refer to when people talk about generational politics being bullshit. Not in the case of the baby boomers, because our entire social system, including the school system that we're talking about, we now used to hold everything together, was built off the assumption of the growth rates and the maintenance rates of the baby boom. And that was maintained in Gen X and millennial generation largely through immigration and integration.
And now it's done.
And that's over. Which is why Zoomers, my friends, are a tiny generation comparatively. Like,
we look great and we have wonderful vibes, so I think that's okay.
Good, but in the long run, I'm not. I talk about this in the long durée. I'm not even sure that it's going to be bad 2 or 3 generations down.
But we're in a moment of transition that people are unwilling to face.
Right, and to be fair, we're not the only one who's going to face it. Europe has already been facing it, and you want to talk about acting like they're insane. This is why there's such a right-wing movement in Europe, is they legitimately are aged completely out, yet also have a high youth unemployment rate. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. It's similar like in Japan and South Korea too.
Yeah, and we're seeing it, and this is the Peter Zion thing. It's going to hit China actually super hard starting now. It's starting now, and and you're going to see like potentially near 1 billion people just die of old age, and we have like when people are like, oh, that's not a big deal. I'm like, we've never seen that before in human history. It's never happened. Like we've never seen multiple societies go through that at once. Like I don't think we've seen societies. It's never happened at the scale. There is no prior human norm to compare this to. Yet, if it does not happen for people, for like the Christian right or even some of the national cons who aren't particularly Christians, like, oh, we need to increase birth rates forever. I'm like, that's not viable either, and you know it.
Yeah.
So
it's about managing the wind down.
Right. So, like, what do you do now that you actually have a natural occurring from relative prosperity wind down of what has been considered a global resource problem? And the thing is, because this is the other problem I have with this book, and I didn't mention it before, is Sandel cannot think of things not in terms of nation states, so he can't see how this is going to interrelate in the future. Like, even though he realizes this is a global problem, and I think his realization in China of all places that amongst elites this is a relatively common attitude, that it's going to be a problem in China too. But I mean, one of the interesting things about like there's all these leftists who justify Chinese leadership, and they'll also rail against the PMC, but then ignore that like most of the CPC are lawyers. Now it's just
business owners.
Yeah, there's less business owners than there are in the American political system. So it's like when people are like, oh, it's not bourgeois. I'm like, okay, so it's PMC, but you hate them too, right? Except when they're Chinese, I guess. Like it's interesting. And in the case of some scholars, like Comrade Liu, I guess you can give it to her that she's explicit about that, and also has a boner for Fordism, even though she won't admit that that's what it is. For when her PMC was good, like she really likes like the establishment of the ADA, for example, which I think is like, she's like, oh, that proved that when doctors were moral, and I'm like, what are you on? That was completely like,
that proves that HW was our greatest president.
Yeah. No, not the Americans with Disabilities Act. The American doctor, or the APA, the American Physician Association. Like,
okay.
like these early 20th century like cartelizations that like went on.
They're the ones who stopped universal health care from happening. Also.
I know it's bizarre that you would celebrate that, but it tells you like that's what people, that's what. One of the interesting things about the critique of meritocracy is basically this is not the case for Sandel, but it is the case for some of the people Sandel cites, like Michael Young. What they want is their 1950s Fordist meritocracy back, which you're not going to get. Like that was the conditions that made that possible are, particularly one where that's done through regulation instead of government largesse, like it was in the social democratic countries in Europe, just do not exist now.
I have a theory that a lot of critics of meritocracy want the WASPs back because it enabled them to do the two types of criticism that they like, which is the elite doesn't deserve it, but is managing things as an elite, and so is easy to identify. It's like Sandel contributes to this a little bit when he's like, undermine the efficacy of presenting meritocracy as natural by randomizing, giving out acceptances at Harvard or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, he basically argues that elite universities should like give stuff out by sortition, which I'm like, okay, in so much that we don't make all universities elite, then sure, but like,
yeah. I mean, and he also is like, that's easier to do than just like making Harvard 3 times larger, which is like, I think they're about the same level of difficulty personally. In fact, it's probably easier to make elite universities larger.
But they wouldn't be elite anymore.
Like, then the yield rates would go down, the acceptance rates would go up. it'd be a terrible situation for everyone involved. No, but I mean, like, that's the thing. It's about his critique of meritocracy is not really, it doesn't really culminate in eliminating meritocracy. It culminates in undermining it as a value system, which I think is inadequate, personally.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the problem with a lot of these books is they can't imagine like what would ensure, you know, this is my I guess radically, even maybe not even socialist but democratic take. What would make some of these systems more responsive to political will is just like they have to be run truly by their community. And by that I mean like sacrifices, arbitration, all of it. And I can't see like if you're gonna ask tenured professors to actually like really run a school, like
They
really
hate
run
doing
it. They hate doing all that shit. They also hate like doing anything other than research. I mean, for the most part, I mean, like it's there's
You're
some of them
really
like
lucky
teaching
if you
their
have a
elite
professor who
classes, but
likes teaching.
yeah. But it's I mean, one of the weird things about the professor right now is like 90% of their job is not what any of them are interested in, but it's what the public actually views them as for. I mean, the public does not realize that for the professorial standpoint, and even from the standpoint of like grants and whatnot, the research is what they do. In which case, it's really stupid to pretend that you need a teaching corps of researchers, particularly in things like the humanities, where that's just literally. I don't want to say all humanities research is a waste of time, but there's a reason why really arcane forms of critical theory came to dominate because it was a way to just pump out papers. And that is discrediting. The problem that you have is that's discrediting to all fields. Like there's a rational core to the Dave Rubin, James Lindsay stupid fucking, you know, Sage paper critique that they did. And it's not the Sokol thing. It's not that like, oh, ideological biases. It's actually that like most publishing and applied research is bullshit in the sense that the action research methodological standards are weak in almost all cases, and the theoretical frameworks are almost always semi-arbitrary based off of the preferences of other forms of academia. And I know that makes people uncomfortable, but it is kind of the case for applied research. And you want to see where this really shows up. We've been talking about a lot today, but it's my field. It's education. Like you can have things taught as facts in education schools that have been frankly debunked for a generation and a half. And yet not just will they be taught, you will get grants and charter schools opened off of it, and people will talk about how it has an evidence-based efficacy, even though no one can even point out how you would prove it. Right now, that is a crisis of merit, unquestionably. And it shows up sometimes, like people, for example, don't really take EEDs as seriously, you know, like, and yet when I think about some degrees that people do take seriously, I can see that they have the same structural flaw.
Yeah.
And for people go, well, that doesn't apply to hard sciences, they still get funding. Increasingly, they don't. And they have to rely increasingly on the intelligence agencies, which I also want to, in the military, which is actually not new, but
no, but it is also. I mean, increasingly, if you want to be a serious researcher, you go to like Raytheon or something.
right.
You know, like I've got a buddy
Or the
who,
DoD.
or the DoD. I've got a buddy who's a brilliant like physics CS guy, super smart.
Uh-huh.
And he's at Boston Dynamics now. Why? Because they would fund the thing he actually cares about, which is like studying waves, basically. You know, and he's not. That's just the way the system works. You know, I'm not going to ask him to like not work in that because I want him to have a good job. What I'm going to ask is I'm going to ask for a politics which prioritizes making it possible to fund things not just related to making the military work better, rather than sometimes getting benefits for the rest of society from military research that is not immediately applicable to producing weapons.
Right. And even then, usually it's farmed out arbitrarily to some. And this also happens. I mean, my brother, who is a conservative who believes in socialized medicine. He's a fun guy in that sense. But
so he's based.
Yeah, if you want to get him on a rant, have him talk about the privatization of NIH funded private development, because I was like, oh yeah, you always give me this shit about patent law, but most 60% of all drugs are developed either abroad or by national or by NIH funding, of which then is immediately privatized and turned over for their profits for an inordinate amount of time. Like, even though it was publicly funded, because the market doesn't fund this shit. And so your entire justification base, and is a lie. And I'm going to tell you, my brother is a conservative. He used to be a Republican. Now he's kind of a freelancer. But like, it's an interesting thing to look at, because he's absolutely right, even from the standpoint of public policy. And he points out that, like, it doesn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans, they both do this.
Yeah.
Like, and they don't get money back from these corporations by giving them this research for free either.
No, like, it's just that there's an insufficient will to do any type of deep reform.
Right. And so, and he thinks, and I think he's right about this, that this is why there's so much weird anti-medicine conspiracies in U.S. society in particular, is because people kind of half know this and then deduce wild conspiracies to explain it.
Yeah, they're like, COVID was made to buttress the like profit rates of big pharma companies through Operation Warp Speed or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which also is weird, because those people are pro-Trump and Trump's. But anyway, but there is a way in which, like, if you see the corruption in the system, but you don't understand how it works, and you don't understand the klug and just the fucking apathy that led to it. And you also, weirdly, one of the things I find interesting about the populist response to meritocracy that I don't think Sandel goes into enough is that it weirdly actually grants meritocratic competence to these people a lot of the time. It just assumes they're morally reprobate.
Yeah, no, I mean, it says that they're like hyper effective, but it also says that expertise is just like aligned with being immoral, basically.
Right. Which to be fair, you see on the left too, but it's usually just the CIA, whereas like conservatives is all the government and most of business. Like,
yeah, I think it's much more frightening for people to say that like the experts actually don't really know what they're doing, except in their very narrow field.
Right. The Joseph Tainter reality of it, which is like, as your society gets more complicated, your experts necessarily become more narrow. And because of that, they outsource more of their thinking to other people. And because of that, if it's a field that's not really, its narrow niche is not immediately applicable, there's really no undoing serious thinking in that area.
What you want is, I mean, what is an actually useful corrective is a situation where the vast majority of people are fairly good generalists.
Right. Which is in our current educational environment,
not
all the generalist institutions are falling apart.
Yeah.
I mean, from liberal arts colleges to high school, like, and
there's, I don't know. I was thinking about bringing this in this time, but since I went to see my dad's family, I didn't have time to add a new book. But there's this book called Justice by Lottery, which I don't know if you've ever read. Basically, it makes the argument for sortition as the way of organizing society,
which I'm vaguely for.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's a really fun book where
It's
it's
the
like,
Barbara Godwin book.
yeah, I think so. And it seeks to reconcile the necessity of expertise with the desire for the genuine equality, which can only be produced by randomness, by having like doctors spend 4 years being a doctor and then 1 year doing like a random job.
So, one of the ironies where I get all defend the PRC about, which is funny because I tend to be. I've been told I'm too China critical by some people, and then I'm told I'm a China stooge by others. But
I think you're just right.
I do think accidentally the Cultural Revolution, Russification, produced a very rigorous elite in China that is responsive, and what this book, and this is one of the things when I talk about this book about, when people tell me about the China miracle, I'm like, it's going to go away once the current educated specialists take control. So when this mass of old people dying, we are talking about a mass in a real sense here, of just natural causes, the kind of expertise with a huge amount of sortition through urban to rural rustification, that wasn't sortition wasn't the aim of the policy, but it is what it achieved. That makes Chinese society more cohesive and there be less social distances between otherwise fairly isolated classes. That's going to go away. That does not exist in Sandel. That does not exist in 20 somethings in China right now. And so this is actually why Mike Davis is one of the reasons. The other reason is he sees that as why there's a Bonapartist tendency in China now, is because that the old collective guard that was really invested in collective leadership for whatever reason, if you like Deng or not, if you like Mao or not, like it experienced this as a mass social integration movement.
I think
that's gone.
You also see this in the continuing lionization of military members as political leaders. It comes from a memory of the time when the draft was a sortitionist policy that could reasonably result in somebody who came from elite sectors and was being, bred for leadership, coming into contact with people who were very different from them and having to adopt a generalist mindset for at least a year or two of their life. And this is no longer the case either, because the military leadership has also been professionalized.
Right,
And
which was predicted by James Burnham.
Was predicted by James Burnham, though he didn't
call how it was going to get professionalized.
No.
But,
and he also overstated the case for like a continuing military elite governing the country.
Oh no, I mean like you want to get me ranting, get me talking about how people who talk about how James Burnham was right ignores what he actually said was going to happen, because
he's like Eisenhower will be in charge forever. And it's like,
yeah, he basically thought we were going to have 100,000 Eisenhowers, and he did not see the like his fear about the managerial elite was not a fear of education the way it is now. It was a fear of the military industrial complex as a liberal orientation.
Yeah.
Of which he actually said, fuck it, let's just do that. I mean, if you read like the New Machiavellians, not just the managerial revolution, he says, fuck it, let's just like double down on this elite and just make sure they're in our good free market military that will have the moral virtues from our entrepreneurial system to actually be a good elite, as opposed to the fascists who I kind of put my money on in World War II. I know he doesn't admit that, but he did. Are the communists or the socialists? Like, he's just like, that's how we're going to check this. He didn't have a vision of business doing that. Like, no. And so, and in fact, he actually thought that the need for professionals in business through the limited liability stock company would mean that they couldn't do it anymore. And interestingly, in America, you kind of get the worst of both worlds, are all worlds, because my whole thing is like, Burnham was wrong about the explicit military power, but he was actually right that for some reason that's not entirely clear to me, no matter how unpopular U.S. wars get, etc., no matter how unpopular even soldiers get, the military is broadly seen as a good institution. One, because it gets a lot of people out of lumpinization, and and you're right. It's almost like, well, some of you just randomly are going to get picked up by the government, and if you don't die, you got actually social democracy in militant form, or at least Keynesianism in militant form. Now you don't anymore, actually, but that
But you
was the
did for a long time.
you did until drones. I mean, you did even up into the first part of George W. Bush administration. Like that really ends under Obama, which is also why people are like, well, the poverty draft isn't real. I'm like, no, the poverty draft isn't real. But that's because like you guys we're picking up talking points from 2004 and maintaining them until 2012. But also it's over now. But it doesn't mean it was never real. It was
The
very
poverty
real.
draft isn't real because rather than having American boots on the ground, you increasingly have just like American guns being sent to foreign countries.
Right. Or we, have
Or under
weapons on
Obama
drones.
and Trump, drones.
Right. So it's just like it is a commodification and automation of what used to be um ironically one of the few actually meritocratic things in the fucking country.
Yeah.
And it's always been the irony, like when I know this was partly done to freak people out against the Bush wars, but it was always ironic to me that there would be all these calls to reinstate the draft during the Iraq war, right? It was always progressives doing it, partly probably to freak young people out and in a lower information time period, but also because I think they really believe this, and I think they are actually ironically right, that U.S. war policy was more responsive to public opinion when not because like the soldiers could end the war likely, like it wasn't like mutinies into Vietnam, the Viet Cong did, but and I'm just going to reiterate that over and over and over again until people get it through their thick skull when they
The
talk about
boomers did
protesting.
not end Vietnam by
No,
protesting.
right? They did not. They did not either in mutinies or at home. The Viet Cong into Vietnam. However, what radically it did have an effect because the military made sure that they were not going to have an unpopular war again. So how would you have an unpopular war with a conscript army? Well, instead of only going to war when it was democratically viable, aka when you're attacked, just get rid of the conscript army. Like keep it on paper, but so in absolute emergencies you got it, I guess. But get rid of it as a principle. And now I'm going to say that the biggest check against that argument about the public being like that is the IDF. So,
I mean, they don't really have unpopular wars. The wars that they do are mostly pretty popular, is the thing.
Yeah.
Like having a conscript army is not a check on war. It's a check on wars that don't have broad social support.
Right. So, for example, it might not having a conscript army might not have stopped the Iraq War, or well, maybe the Iraq War, but not
But
the
not
Afghanistan War.
Afghanistan.
However, it probably would have shortened it by dramatically.
Yes.
Um,
And you actually do see that borne out even in conscript armies like the IDF. I mean, 2006 Lebanon did not last for like that long because most of Israel did not like it.
So for those of you like conscript's not going to fix everything, no, I don't think that, but it's an illustration of the point. Like in some ways, if you want a meritocratic world, getting into institutions has to be, frankly, just fucking arbitrary.
Yeah.
Or it has to be like open to everyone, and then the problem that you get is like, how do you figure out who gets training without it being gameable by the rich? And if you're like me and you're like, well, we can do that after we have destroyed wealth as we know it, then I have an answer for that. But in the immediate term, which is where we all live, I don't. So you do need stuff like sortition, and I think Sandel's right about that. But I do see like, who fucking cares to some degree if like Harvard is still super elite but random? like that you just accept randomly. I do think, ironically, and this is one thing I'm going to agree with Sandel about, the push for holistic acceptance actually has made elite bias worse in a
So
way that is
he's
absolutely objective.
he's
Like,
actually he's against that, Varn. He talks about how the SAT is like worse.
yeah, I
Um,
know. I read that part and I was like, yeah, you're right. You can game the SAT in the test system, but when you take it away, what happens?
you can game other stuff more.
Right, and we see that because the institutions that have taken that stuff away are actually less economically diverse.
He's in
Right.
favor of having entrance based on high school grades.
Well,
Um,
that would make sense if high schools were
uniform.
This is where I did sort of find him to be like, I don't think you understand the rest of the education system that well, like because high schools in America are like public schools are probably as class coded as private schools are, if not more so.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
one of the
especially in the sciences also.
yeah, I mean it's ridiculous. Like I mean you see that where you're at in the Northeast in particular.
In contrast also to where some of my family's at in the Mountain West, where like they do not teach evolution, for example.
But we do teach evolution, but like the science, but you're still in general like sciences here are like, or even it shows that like it's obvious in the South, okay, but it's because for a variety of reasons the brutality of the school system is made obvious there. But like, and I'm going to be careful about how I say this, but one of the things I'll tell you, if you look at, for example, a middle tier state like Utah in education, we have a very good graduation rate. That's the only thing people really count right now because our test scores are invalid in general because of local laws. And they're constantly in fight with feds, but we can't use it for anything. It's not valid because of that. So what do we have? Well, we have a graduation rate, which is what the federal government now focuses on. What I can tell you that every major official in the state has admitted to me at conferences when I've asked this question, and yet they don't, and they've admitted it's bad, but they and they are concerned about it, but they don't know how to do anything about it because they're not wanting to change policies. In fact, the policies that they change actually accelerate this. Is that they want to get to graduation and weight up so bad that they've noticed that even for basic stuff, even students with elite grades, like we're talking about public school valedictorians, will need to take remedial coursework in college. All right. Like I want that to sit in with people. And what that's led to in general is a weird thing amongst people your age, Elijah. Where like the top 10% are hustling more than they've ever hustled in their fucking life. I mean,
I'm
the
hustling.
people, yeah, the people in the elite schools are hustling more than ever. But 90% of the population has given up. And that includes from good class coded public schools and private schools. That is
Yes.
like it is become a like rat race of the top 10% and then nothing for anyone else. And they're giving up on universities and they're giving it, but they're also not replacing it with like vocational education or stuff like that.
There's just nothing.
There's just nothing. And it's going to be a problem in about 4 or 5 years where we're going to start see that like the next
It's
recession
already a
that
problem.
comes.
I mean, it's like
Yeah, we're lacking skilled labor and yet we're also not paying for skilled labor and we can't and there's
and we're not bringing in immigrants who are skilled laborers.
Yeah, because of for political reasons and that's bipartisan people. So what do you have? And I'm also not sure, I'm going to say this too, I'm not sure we have the ability to attract the same thing because one of the things that as India in particular develops, one, I think the face of, how do I say this without sounding like I'm promoting ethnic conspiracies? The face of the group that has somewhat liberal values but conservative policies on certain things, which in paleoconservative terms for vaguely anti-Semitic reasons and vaguely truth reasons was associated with Jews and later on Asians. We'll start seeing South Asians be the face of that. So, for example, we talked about this last time. We talked about like Democratic voters who are supporting Modi, but over time they're going to become just regular, like neoconservatives, probably. That if Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yeah, not Vivek because he's like a lunatic, but like Nikki Haley.
Right, but I think Vivek is a lunatic.
A good example of this, but his politics are not really amenable to.
Bobby Jindal's another one.
Bobby Jindal's a good example.
Yeah. You're going to see a lot more of that in the future, and interestingly, that's a mixture of that we don't let non-elite.
But I think the funny thing is you're going to see those people, that type of person with a D next to their name.
Oh yeah, I know. I think that's, but that was true with the two other minority groups that I don't want to start anti-pogroms against. I mean, that was true with the Jewish Americans and with Asian Americans too. That they were pretty evenly divided amongst Republicans and Democrats until the racial backlash of 2008.
I don't know very much about Asian politics, but Jewish politics, I disagree with that. They were pretty, I mean, post FDR, they were pretty uniformly Democratic. But they would side in local elections and state level elections with the Republican candidate. Like a good example is
but Jewish conservative leaders became the think tank of the GOP.
Oh yeah, that's
absolutely
true. Yeah. If you're talking about
I'm not talking about the general community. No, I mean,
if you're talking about the leadership, I agree with you.
In the general community, what you saw was actually an elite consensus that was broadly speaking liberal, and that paradox led to anti-Semites actually like coming up with theories about it. Kevin McDonald, I believe was his name. No, it's McDonald. Kevin McDonald, I don't want to slander. He's a guy from Canada who was in Kids Hall. But a McDonald guy who I don't really want people looking up anyway, who came up with this idea about Jewish people like promoting liberalism internally. But anyway,
I'd like to reiterate to listeners, Varn and I are both Jewish.
Yeah, so this is just so you know, I'm not encouraging it. This is true. I just know these theories. You're even religiously Jewish. Like, you are what I like to call a double, which is rare. All right.
I get the points.
So anyway, my point about this is it leads to weird dynamics.
Yes.
And it leads to also like, and I think we can even see this with like, we mentioned this with educated Black women. And this is enough, and we mentioned this as a weakness of the book because the politics of humiliation really don't seem to apply to minority communities in the same way, and particularly the Black community in specific, where you think it would. Like,
I mean, I think especially with the prime meritocrat of the past 30 years is Barack Obama.
Right. Of who there is some resentment at because, because it does follow that pattern where we talk about where like, oh, children of immigrants and or from either Africa or Caribbean and or mixed race people representing the community. But this, despite some Adolf stuff that happened afterwards, that by and large was not a talking point anytime during the Obama administration. It kind of came up in 2007. I think it came up cynically, actually. But I don't know this. I can't prove this. All right, but I kind of feel like it came from Clintonites in 2007 because Clinton had very much had we represent the Arkansas white working class Democrat. That was, and I know people think that's wild because of her 2016 run, but she did try to pull that stunt in 2007. And the other thing I think they did was Obama isn't Black enough. So, it didn't work at all. right? And so you're right. Like the poster child for meritocracy is in the United States is Barack Obama. Um, you know, now there is complications to that narrative. Obama's white family is not just white; they're white elites and who like by marriage go back to the same people that like the Bushes are related to.
I mean, I think
But
that is one reason he is the prime meritocrat, though. He is broadly reflective of what meritocracy actually looks like.
right, which is like somebody kind of getting a chance through knowing somebody who comes from the real actual elite.
And
Um,
working very hard, but
I mean,
also them being so interrelated as to be unable to separate.
one of the things that I think is interesting about Trump is Trump in some ways actually, even though he comes from a relatively elite bourgeois background compared to most people, he is not he from the Brahmin old families of the United States, and he's actually one of the first presidents who isn't. The other example is Kennedy, but they became a Brahmin family, right?
Well, Biden is not from a Brahmin family either.
No, actually, no, you're right, but
Neither
so
was Clinton.
it used to be Democrats. Um, actually, relatively conservative Democrats, but it used to be Democrats. Whereas, but interestingly, what you have in Clinton, and I know it's hard for us to remember this because we think of the Kennedys and Clintons as like the elites of the country, and they are now. But that's in one lifetime, effectively. And the Kennedys isn't too, but um, like we've seen the rise and fall of new elite families twice, in my parents' lifetime. So if you're a baby boomer, you've seen two Camelots basically, and one you don't have to deal with its collapse because the president gets assassinated, and the other everyone is sort of like pretending that they never felt like the Clinton administration was a Camelot in the first place. Um, and then you have the Obama, who's the poster child for meritocracy in another way too, is he doesn't change anything. Like Obama's institutional instincts were remarkably conservative given the kind of policy and what he represented to people, which was a massive shift in the Democratic Party towards its future base at the time.
And towards liberalism. I mean,
Yeah, and towards liberalism.
he won in 2008 largely because he voted against, or he was an active opponent of the Iraq War.
Right. Who's not an anti-war candidate in general, but you were right. He's an active opponent of the Iraq War. Was pro-Afghanistan, and people ignored that. But he was, and he was groomed for the position too. I mean, like Adolf Reed is right about that, about Chicago, about the Democratic Chicago machine. But I think one of the things that you get with Obama is also, even when you bring someone new and they represent something new into this meritocratic system because they are new. All right. Let's compare this to Biden. You're right. Biden doesn't come from an elite family. He's another, like his family's elite now, but it's because of him. And similarly to the Kennedys, I'm not surprised by Biden corruption scandals because they marry the Kennedys and more than being Catholic. Like, but let's ignore that for a second. Biden comes up, right? But because he's an established name and he's established in the old guard of the party, even though he's not from this new part, he actually does have within the meritocratic framework the ability to appoint new elites in a way for both racial and representational reasons. Racial reasons probably first, but I also think because of what Obama represented, even if he had been white, let's say he'd been John Edwards, for example, for people who remember that candidate. I also think you would have ended up having institutional pressure within the Democratic Party to be more conservative in appointees and whatnot, which is what we got with Obama. I think ultimately, if they can get rid of someone like John Edwards, that's what they would have got with John Edwards or Howard Dean, for people who remember him. I know I'm talking about people of your childhood, Elijah, but it was
I'm
my
knowledgeable
teens.
enough to remember who these people
Yeah.
were.
I'm just remember, as like, if people were talking about Gary Hart, and when I was 22, would I know what they were talking about? No. Because that's literally the exact equivalent. Um, so I think it's interesting to think about what that has meant systemically. And I think we have to blame some of that on the racial politics of the United States, but I don't think it's just that. I think if we'd had any new strain of, if you'd had anything representing another new strain, because you just had a major strain change in the Democratic Party, because the Atari Democrats get manifested in an entirely new family, in the Clinton families, in this entirely new political clans. And you know, you brought it up. You're actually right. Even the weird Republicans like Reagan actually came from old families. Trump is weird in that, and I should have stated this more accurately. He's weird in that he's in that on the GOP side. Like, the Democrats since Kennedy, Johnson comes from an old Texas family, so I don't know how you count that. But like,
Johnson grew up like destitute though, so it's a little weird
yes,
because he comes from an old Texas family that
but was
lost all of
poor,
its money and then like he kind of made it back.
right?
Carter came from just like middle class, I think.
Yeah, he was a middle. He is truly a middle class, out of nowhere kind of
Guy.
local
Yeah.
politician from Georgia.
Clinton grew up like destitute. Um, you know,
Yeah, although Hillary Rodham Clinton does come from old power backgrounds, but not from the Democratic Party. She comes from the Republican side,
yeah.
actually. So like, um, but you're right. Clinton comes from that. Uh, the the exceptions were actually the Democratic candidates that lost. Like, whenever Democrats try to pick like old family candidates, it's like the Careys, for example, are the Gores. Then they are. They don't win. Um, which is always interesting to me, because I'm like, the liberal impulse. There's a weird impulse in liberal elites, and then I'm gonna shut off this into the conversation and go behind the Patreon wall. But I think, and by the way, for those of you listening, by the Patreon wall, and it will have been released like a month before this conversation comes out. Um, the There's a weird tendency and liberal elites to want to establish dynasties. Actually, like, that's a real thing that I cannot explain, and yet there's literally no taste in like, broadly speaking, left liberal democratic policy for that to actually happen. Like,
I mean, the
the
Kennedys are like the closest approximation and they collapsed.
right. The Roosevelts are the other closest approximation, and they weren't even in the same fucking party. Like, it's you just look at this and you're like, why do you guys have an impulse for this when like your own history indicates that you don't do this?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
that's
you see this sometimes at like the state level, but
right.
not these like multiple presidents. Though, of course, like the first time, like the Bushes were the first father and son duo since the Adams.
Correct.
So it's just not very prevalent in American history. Uh,
But there's a weird tendency to want it,
yeah,
and I don't know what that's about. Like,
people love their kids, man. Maybe it's just I don't know.
yeah, but weirdly, it's not like it's not like you know, the Bushes are encouraging Jenna Bush to go and become a political figure. I mean, I find that interesting. I guess there was some push for that with Chelsea Clinton, but not a lot.
I think one of the Bushes is actually like Texas Railroad Commissioner or something now, which is the position in charge of the oil, by the way, in Texas. But yeah, there's not. I don't know. I mean, this is a conversation that we'll have more data points in about 20 years. So it's kind of fruitless to engage in now.
Which is interesting to me for this argument about the tyranny of merit and this true thing in which merit has hidden a kind of. There is a real sense in which meritocracy in the United States actually has an aristocratic imperative in it that's kind of hidden, but also it doesn't take that long to pull it apart, like C. Sandel. But what's weird about that is it actually doesn't establish political aristocracy that much. It establishes
like business aristocracy,
administrative drift, trust fund kids. Like, so there is an aristocracy in the United States, but it's kind of
it used to be center in the same way it used to be.
Right. It's not. And interestingly, at the moment where the meritocracy seems to be breaking down, one of the things I think is interesting that like Sandel doesn't totally deal with is like the idea that universities would be a general aristocracy, like a general meritocratic generator of natural aristocracy. And I know they would never say that that's what they're doing, but that's what that's what they're doing. Weirdly, that actually comes with the democratization of the universities, because it's not like pre-GI Bill universities were particularly fucking like non-meritocratic. It just, they weren't as essential of an institution to society. That's a baby boomer phenomenon. And it's one that like nobody has a particularly good narrative for, because like for all of the like, you know, Republicans' attacks on higher ed, they're totally still dependent on all that shit, and they can't they're not really trying to like dismantle it at all. You know, not other, you know, like, yeah, they can mess with the humanities and call about the PC police, but like no one's calling for decredentialization generally. So I think that's an interesting and that leads to like, I guess the problem that Sandel can't fix is how do you simplify a society where you could realistically call for like decredentialization? You know, and the only thing I can come up with is like, well, you need more radically democratic institutions to control these people and make them responsive, you know, through being able to be replaced. But I don't know that you can just get rid of them tomorrow. There's no way to do that. Right? Like, someone's got to make sure the nuclear reactors don't blow up. Like, you know, like that is real
job.
And that goes back to that paradox that I was talking about with my liberal friend, where he doesn't entirely not have a point. You do have to have someone who knows how the nuclear reactor works. My thing is like, well, how do you control them if you believe politics, not the implementation of policy, but the creation of policy requires experts? You can't really believe in democracy and believe that. I don't think. And that seems like that's a deeper problem than what Sandel is actually dealing with. And on that note, we're going to talk regular old U.S. politics after the break, behind the wall. I guess we kind of did that anyway. Thank you, Elijah.
We didn't actually more exactingly.
Yeah, we'll do it in ways that will annoy people. And you can hear that Elijah and I differ on things. For example, that Elijah thinks you should vote, and I think you should. I can't say what I think you should do, but so people can infer what they would like. All right, and on that note,
thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.